Thank you, Indika. Thank you, Nagarajji. Thank you, Hariji, for inviting me to present my paper at this conference. The paper is titled A Rebuttal of the Greater Magadha Thesis. The Greater Magadha Thesis was formulated by Professor Johannes Bronkhorst, one of the most prominent Indologists in Western academia, in his 2007 book, also titled as Greater Magadha. His provocative thesis has generated a lot of discussion and controversy in the academia since then. Recently, a conference was also organized to retrospectively evaluate some of his claims first put forward in his book, Greater Magadha. I can't move my presentation. Can I?
Have you shared it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you see this? Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Perfect. So this is the plan of my presentation. I will provide a rebuttal to some of the claims made by Professor Johannes Bronkhorst. Some of the rebuttals have already been provided by Indologists before, while some of them will be presented here for the first time. This presentation is divided into following parts. There is a very brief introduction. My second part is I will show the presence of Vedic religion in the Greater Magadha region, which Bronkhorst completely ignores. My third part is a critical appraisal of the ideas and philosophy that Bronkhorst claims originated in the Greater Magadha. Though I say that the ideas developed further in the Greater Magadha region, but they were indebted to the Vedic tradition. It's a small introduction. I've taken this map from Wikipedia, but I think this is good enough for our purposes here. 500 BCE, 400 BCE, time of Buddha. I have drawn a black line to separate the two regions. That one is the Kuru Panchala region, which is the Vedic region as per Professor Bronkhorst. And the other region, the Greater Magadha region, is the Kosala and the Magadha region, Magadha-Anga belt. So we have to remember Kosala Panchala is the Vedic region and Kosala Magadha-Anga is the Greater Magadha region of the Shramana religion. Now, Professor Bronkhorst contends that there were two well-defined geographic regions of India with distinct culture and philosophy, Shramana and Vedic, that developed independently of each other before coming into contact with one another from the 2nd and 1st century BCE onwards. This led to the appropriation by the ritualistic Vedic tradition of the ideas of karma, immutable atma, Ayurveda, and asceticism, which Bronkhorst claimed were initially exclusive to the spiritual culture of Greater Magadha, the birthplace of Shramana religions. His thesis problematizes the generally accepted historiography of ancient India that assigns a chronological priority to the Vedic text. He makes these astonishing claims based on a few textual evidences. First is the Patanjali Mahabhashya, which claims that the core Brahmanic region is to a place to the west of Greater Magadha region. Professor Bronkhorst says that most of the kings of Greater Magadha region were non-Vedic. Professor Bronkhorst also points out to certain less than flattering descriptions in late Vedic text of the people to the east of Kuru Panchala, which is the people of the Greater Magadha region. Again, just to repeat, a distinct philosophy belonging to the Greater Magadha region. The philosophies of Greater Magadha regions are Ayurveda, asceticism and meditation, Kapila Muni of Sankhya fame, the idea of immutable Atma or an inactive soul, karma and rebirth. He says all these ideas belong to the Greater Magadha region, which the Brahmins later appropriated. Well, in this section, I will...
Manish, your screen is has to be adjusted. I think you're using a PDF. Your screen is... I'm seeing only half of it.
Is it?
You have to... I think you have over-zoomed it.
What makes sense?
Now you can just go to slide 5 or this
is fine.
No, go back. There's something. Is anybody else also having the same problem? Okay.
At my end, it looks okay.
Yeah,
Harish.
it's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I will talk about the presence of Vedic tradition in the Greater Magadha region. Okay. So what makes a region Brahmanical? Bronkhorst presents a very, very idiosyncratic definition of what constitutes a region as Vedic. In his first few pages of Greater Magadha, he says Brahmins have to be recognized as people who are members of the highest group of society by birthright. This recognition has to come from other members of society, to begin with local rulers. Notice the recognition criteria here. Later on, he explains further. He says, in Kuru Panchala, we may assume that Brahmins did receive this esteem, at least to some extent. Notice the word esteem. And he says that Greater Magadha was not Vedic because Brahmins living in it did not receive the esteem which they deemed themselves entitled to. Now, Bronkhorst does not deny that there were Brahmins in the Greater Magadha region. He only says that they did not receive the recognition and esteem. Now, recognition and esteem is such a vague criteria that whatever evidences we may throw at Bronkhorst, he has a plausible deniability. What constitutes esteem? If the king of the region participates in and organizes large Vedic sacrifice, is it esteem enough for him? And what does esteem has to do with the culture of the society? In what follows, I will show the pervasive presence of Vedic thought and Brahmins in the Greater Magadha region that Bronkhorst completely ignores. I have divided into 4 parts. So, the Brahmin presence in the Magadha-Anga region. Magadha-Anga region is to the easternmost part of the Greater Magadha region. Evidently, the Brahmin presence is less here. What I found is there are 5 Brahmin villages. 2 of them have been donated by Bimbisara, the king of Magadha. In one of the villages, there was a large Shrota sacrifice performed. And Champa is actually a capital of the Anga region. Magadha also had a Brahmin chief minister, Vasakara, under the rule of Ajatashatru. Jataka story suggests that Magadhan princes such as Brahmadatta Kumara and Duryodhana were educated in northwestern India in Takshila. Well, this is the evidences that we have, and I would give Bronkhorst the benefit of doubt that these are not much of evidences. However, things starts to change and look very interesting once we move to Kosala, at the heart of the Greater Magadha region. In this region, I will show that the king Prasanjit of Kosala, the contemporary and a childhood friend of Buddha, was a follower of Vedic religion. He organized and performed large Shrauta sacrifice. He gave large villages to Vedic Brahmins and scholars, and he held Brahmins in high esteem. Notice the word esteem. Out of the 11 Brahmin villages located in Kosala, 4 of them were donated by King Prasanjita. In one of the places, a very prominent Brahmin has been honored, respected, revered, venerated, and esteemed by King Prasanjita of Kosala. In another evidence in the Pali text, we have a situation where Buddha criticizes, where Prasanjit criticizes his wife for following the words of Buddha uncritically. However, for me, the clinching evidence of the religious belief of King Prasanjita comes at Samyutta Nikaya at this passage. It says at Shravasti, now on that occasion, a great sacrifice had been set up for King Prasanjit of course. 500 bulls, 500 bullocks, 500 heifers, 500 goats, and 500 rams had been led to the pillars for the sacrifice. Here we have it that the king Prasanjita organized and performed a large Shrauta sacrifice. Buddha criticizes him. However, Buddhist text is silent if he accepted his advice. Only someone who follows the Vedic religion will organize and participate in such large Shrauta sacrifice. We'll go to the evidence from Vedic text. The Sankhya Shrota Sutra mentions King Para, son of Anar, as a ruler of both Kosala and Videha. Remember, Videha region is pre-Buddhist. It was before the time of Buddha. So Sankhya Shrota Sutra is saying that a Vedic king was both a ruler of Kosala and Videha. The same text also explains that the three states, Kashi, Kosala, Videha, sometime had the same royal Purohita, Jala Jatu Karnya. Similarly, Kanva Shatapatha Brahmana says that King Para performed a large Shrota sacrifice. This shows that even earlier than the time of Buddha, Kosala had kings who performed Vedic religions, who followed Vedic religion. If this evidence is not enough for the Vedic kingdom of Kosala, then what it is? All the evidence suggests that Brahmins received a lot of esteem and recognition in Kosala, however we may define the term esteem and recognition. What Bronkhorst could have done is he could have reduced the geography of Greater Magadha just to Magadha-Anga region. But he can't, because Kosala is important for the development of Buddhism. Buddha was born in Kosala and spent most of his life there. Buddha replies to the king Bimbisara on giving his introduction. King, straight ahead is a principality endowed with wealth and vigor from the slope of the Himalayas situated among the Kosalans. They are indeed Aditya by lineage and Shakya by birth. From that family, I have gone forth, king. Buddha is saying that he is a Kosalan. He belongs to the Suryavanshi lineage of the king Ishvaku. Aditya means the solar line. Most of the interaction with Buddha were with the Kosalan Brahmins, and it is in Kosala that Buddhist philosophy developed. So what does Bronkhorst do with this Kosala Conundrum? He ignores it. He shockingly ignores it. The term Kosala occurs only 6 times. 5 of these references are to quotes from other scholars and texts. The only time Bronkhorst uses the term Kosala himself is when he describes the geography of Greater Magadha. There is no discussion of Kosala and King Prasenjita in his 400-page tome Greater Magadha. You cannot have a Greater Magadha without Kosala in it. Recently, in a conference, he says that he does not mind changing his book from Greater Magadha to Greater Kosala. As we have seen, our professor is obviously bluffing here. The evidences from Kosala will problematize his thesis. So tactfully, he ignores it. But we are not done yet. There is a Vedic school in Greater Magadha. According to the work of Michael Witzel, Madhyandina and the Kanva branches of the White Ayurveda were located in the Videha Kosala region, respectively. What does Bronkhorst do? He ignores it. In a footnote, he expresses surprise that the Yagnavalkya Kanda of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is set in the pre-Buddhist Videha region during the rule of the ancient king Janaka. Brahmins and Vedic thought in early Buddhist texts. If Bronkhorst's Greater Magadha thesis was correct, then we would expect the early Buddhist texts to be relatively free of Vedic influence and vocabulary, which would only show up in the latter strata of Buddhist literature, when the two cultures purportedly came into contact with each other. However, from the very earliest of Buddhist texts, interaction with Brahmins is predominant and Vedic terminology and ideas are pervasive, as we'll see below. Sutta Nipata is considered to be the earliest text, and within it, the Athaka Vagga and the certain sections of the Parayana Vagga is considered to be the earliest. Many scholars recently have worked on these texts, and they have come up with surprising findings. McGovern, in his 2018 monograph Snake and the Mongoose, says, based on his analysis of Athaka and Parayana Vagga, the earliest identity we find articulated by the Buddhist and Jains is a self-consciously Brahmanical identity. Similarly, Lauren Bosch says there is a very close relationship and perhaps even a shared identity between some of the Kanava Brahmins and Buddhists in Kosala. This is all based on the earliest Buddhist text. As we go further in Sutta Nipata, we find that Buddha is addressed as a Brahmin. Buddha seems very well versed in Vedic religion. I will just give one example. Sutta Nipata 4.457, on being asked if he is a Brahmin, Buddha first says that he has crossed over any such identity. But later, he says that he knows the Savitri in the Gayatri meter. Brett Schultz has worked on this specific passage, and it's a very revealing passage because during the Vedic time, the Savitri mantra was secretive and was only given to Vedic Brahmins who were initiated. And the Gayatri mantra was only given to the Brahmins. Even the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad says that Savitri mantra should not be recited in any other meter, but one should recite the Savitri only as a Gayatri verse. Later, Buddha again says that Savitri is the best of mantras. I mean, from this, the fact that Buddha knows the Savitri in the Gayatri meter, was he initiated as a Vedic student and was he reborn as a Brahmana? It's a question to ponder over. Vedic vocabulary. Again, in the earliest Buddhist texts, we find plethora of Vedic vocabulary. It's filled with it. Terms like dharma, karma, tapas, pragya, dana, brahma, dhyana. They're all present in the earliest of Vedic text. So, to conclude this section, in the discussion above, I've tried to show that the idea that there was a separate geography called Greater Magadha, where Shramana religion grew in splendid isolation from the ancient Vedic tradition, is a fiction. There is a pervasive presence of Vedic thought and Vedic Brahmins in the Greater Magadha region, especially the region of Kosala. So instead of isolated development, the earliest Buddhist text presents a religious milieu in which it is hard to isolate a specific non-Vedic stream. Bronkhorst does not take into account the counter evidences. As we noticed, the entire early Buddhist literature is missing in his thesis. His thesis is based on selective citation of selective text. And just to repeat again, there cannot be a Greater Magadha without a role of Kosala in it, which Johannes Bronkhorst ignores. This is the third part of my presentation. Origins of certain ideas and philosophies. There are certain ideas and philosophies which Bronkhorst claimed originated only in the Greater Magadha region, which was later appropriated by the Brahmins.
10 minutes to go, Manish.
Okay. Ayurveda, Bronkhorst says that Ayurveda it has been taken over by Brahmins from the Greater Magadha region. Bronkhorst relies exclusively on Zayas scholarship, Asceticism and healing in ancient India, in which he states that empirical rational medicine first emerged in Shramana tradition. And this is the only source that Bronkhorst gave to present his thesis of Ayurveda as a Greater Magadha product. There are a lot of problems with his thesis, with Zayas thesis. First of all, he blanks out the entire Vedic literature from the Atharva Veda onwards as not being relevant, because in the Vedic text, the purpose of learning the bodily parts was religious rather than scientific. So using this religious rather than scientific argument, he just blanks out the entire Vedic material from Atharva Veda onwards. But while Buddhist text is purportedly scientific, and therefore it is made to be the precursor to Ayurveda. Then he interprets medical information in early Buddhist text based on 5th century commentary by Buddha Ghosha. He does not take into account that Buddha explicitly warns his monks against practicing medicine. He does not take into account that the three humor etiology, bile, wind, and phlegm, central to Ayurveda, crops up in the later Pali textual corpus without any theoretical reflection on human body and disease. There are other problems with his thesis, but I'll not go there. I'll just stick to point number one. He ignores the sophisticated development of medicine in earlier Vedic texts. Vedic texts haven't been mined for Ayurveda material for some reason. The only text that I know of is by Mridula Shah, who has mined medical information in the Shatapatha Brahmana. She says that there are 39 healing medical plants and herbs used to combat about 30 diseases. There are application of healing balms. There are ways how to cure pus formation in the eyes. Terms like Vata, Pitta, and Kapha are mentioned separately. And she says that the term Kapha is mentioned for the first time in the Shatapatha Brahmana. If you go to the Panini Sutra, he gives sophisticated grammatical rules to derive the name of the disease. Vataki from Vata, Atisaraki from Atisara. You know, there are different grammatical rules. For example, he gives grammatical rules to classify disease based on time, cause, effects, toxicity. And the first datable mention in Indian literature of three bodily humors together, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, occurs in Katyayana's Vartika, 300 to 250 BCE. So what I'm trying to show is there has been a gradual development in Vedic thought of Ayurveda. However, Bronkhorst might come back and say that, oh, all these texts are later to Buddha. So they must have all copied their work, their medical information from the region of Greater Magadha. However, there is a problem. Takshila was the center of medical learning during the time of Buddha. Kenneth Zayas built his case for the Shramana Buddhist origin of Ayurveda based on the medicinal technique of the Magadhan physician, Jivaka. All the Buddhist records available suggest that Jivaka was trained in Takshila from the famous master Atreya Purnavasu, a Brahmin sage often considered as a founder of Ayurveda. If all the Buddhist texts are unanimous that the greatest physician of Magadha got his medical training in Takshila, then what does it say about the Greater Magadha Thesis and the thesis that Ayurveda emerged in Greater Magadha? Bronkhorst's thesis is falsified by the very source he uses to make his claim. Second, asceticism. Bronkhorst asserts that the practice of Jaina meditation and asceticism belong to the non-Vedic stream of Greater Magadha, and this found its way into certain Brahmanical texts. He finds certain similarity in Mahabharata and early Jain texts to make this claim of appropriation. Now, Jain text presents a version of extreme asceticism where bodily and mental activity is brought to a complete halt. Such form of ascetic and meditative practice is carried out to cut off the past karmas and cease any production of new karma. In Jainism, this practice is called Salekhana or religious death. Now, Bronkhorst compares this Jain practice with the Vedic practice of bodily immobility and breath practice of pranayama, which he glosses as complete cessation of breathing, and then astonishingly claims that such Vedic practice are similar to the Jains and therefore it belongs to the region of Greater Magadha. Now, pranayama has a history going back to the ancient Vedic times. In the Brahmanical tradition, pranayama may involve a simple regulation of breath in the ritual sphere or more advanced yogic practice involving control, immobilization, and channelization of breath. But this has nothing to do with Jain practice of inducing death. Pranayama has a history that goes back to the earliest period of Vedic tradition. Pranayama was practiced during the Vedic ritual to generate tapas or inner heat as an inner cleansing technique. Before the recitation or chanting of the Vedic mantras, the practitioner performs a kind of mental concentration through the regulation of breath. The act of regulating the breath is also connected with identifying one's own breath with the breath pervading the entire cosmos. The practice of pranayama and bodily asceticism in the Brahminic text has nothing to do with religious death, except in probably one or two cases in Mahabharata. Now, there is a questionable translation that he makes. He quotes a chapter from Acharanga Sutra Having examined a spot of bare ground, he should remain there, stay, O Brahmana. Bronkhorst uses a German translation of this Jaina text to translate the term Brahmin as a pious one. He translates the term Brahmin as a pious one. However, in his earlier text, for the translation of the same section, Bronkhorst sticks to the term Brahmin. This has repercussion. The appearance of the term Brahmin as an epithet for Mahavira in the earliest of Jain texts puts a question mark on his thesis of some radical separation between Vedic and Shramana cultures. What is even more damning is that there are 8 other references to Brahmin in this text, and all of them refer to Mahavira. So you have it, earliest Jain text, and all the description of the term Brahmin refers to Mahavira. However, Bronkhorst translates it as pious one for some reason. To conclude, Bronkhorst, in order to prove the non-Vedic origin of Vedic meditation and asceticism, has selectively quoted from selective texts, hidden certain terms in the guise of translation, and interpreted the text only in a way that suits his thesis. And the idea of immobility meditation is as old, and it was already practiced in Takshila during the time of Alexander. Here is a quote from a Greek account. And the last sentence, it says that these Brahmin sages, they stood on one leg, holding up both his hand, a beam of a wood about 3 cubits long. When the leg became fatigued, he supported himself on the other and continued thus the whole day long. So immobility body asceticism has a history going back to Takshila in northwestern India during the time of Alexander. And in the Buddhist Sachi Stupa, we again have Brahmins raising their hand up in the Urdhva Bahu Mudra. And this is the earliest graphical account of immobility meditation in our archaeological record. Immutable Soul. Bronkhorst reconstructs a few isolated fragments of the Ajivika literature preserved in the Pali canon to argue that the Vedic idea of an immutable or an inactive soul untouched by karma is similar to that of the Ajivikas. He quotes a certain sentence, from the Samanaphala Sutta, picks up a little snippet and says that this snippet is actually equivalent to the inactive soul of the Brahmanic tradition. Reading this passage, we can speculate that the Ajivikas perhaps believed in a self that had no agency, but it is not at all clear if this is the same definition of the immutable soul as found in the Upanishad and the Bhagavad Gita. The Ajivikas believed that the soul is limited in time and space, and that it has an octagonal or circular shape that occupies an area of 500 yognas. I mean, for Ajivikas, the soul is limited by time and space, which is very radically different from the Vedic idea. However, based on just a small snippet, he claims that the Brahmin copied a small snippet of idea and not the other ideas of soul from the Ajivikas. However, we have an entire prehistory of the idea of immutable soul. This is from the Atharva Veda, which is for the first time talks about the idea of immutable soul. Desireless, wise, immortal, self-existent, satiated with enjoyment, not deficient in any respect. He fears not death, who knows this same Atma, which is wise, ageless, and young. Again, in the Taittiriya Brahmana, the idea of immutable soul, the Nasadiya Sukta says that the world is divided into manifest and the unmanifest aspect. The unmanifest aspect is the secret and the immortal part of Atma, untouched by the visible reality, while the manifest aspect of Atma includes the entire visible world. So the idea of an immutable soul has a long history. There is an evolution that I've shown here. I would say that the Ajivikas were influenced by the Vedic ideas rather than the other way around. Ajivikas believed in a very Brahmanical idea of Brahmaloka found in the early Upanishad. Ajivika penance just before death involves the drinking of a concoction made from cows and lying on the sacred darbha grass, all reminiscent of a Vedic tradition, which just tells you which side, the tradition flowed. This is my last. This is Kapila Muni. He says that the Kapila Muni of the Sankhya fame is from the Greater Magadha region. I won't go into the details. There is a reason why Kapila is called Asura in one of the texts. I won't go there because of lack of time. But in the Buddhist text, there is, or the Jain texts, I have searched, there is no mention of Kapila as somebody from Greater Magadha. In fact, Buddha Ghosha, in his canonical commentary on Digha Nikaya, calls Kapila a Brahmin. Mahavatsu portrays Kapila as a Brahmin sage. And in the entire Mahabharata, which also Bronkhorst also agrees, Kapila is called a supreme among the sages. He is the avatar of Vishnu, and he is called a Vasudeva. The reason why he was called Asura is very technical, and it is about hermeneutics of a certain Vedic text, but that has nothing to do with any outside tradition. Anyways, I will conclude. My conclusion is that Bronkhorst has used selective citation of the available text, inconsistent argument, ignoring counter evidences, and a scholarship that is informed by a remarkable suspicion and hostility towards Brahmins and their texts. In Bronkhorst's reading of Vedic text, early Brahminism has been reduced to a homogenized, ritualistic religion without any internal tensions or contradictions. This allows him to make a very simplistic and an untenable division of ancient India into binary buckets: Vedic, non-Vedic, ritualistic, and spiritual, Brahmin, Shramana. Once these above assumptions are bracketed off, I think a very fertile religious environment of innovation and change emerges in ancient India, where it is impossible to separate in any meaningful way the Vedic from the non-Vedic. But of course, this makes it harder for 21st century Indologists to theorize on ancient Indian culture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manish. Manish is an independent researcher on Indology, and he's also worked as a financial analyst at investment management firms in New York. That was a fantastic presentation, Manish.